I am Fred, and you're watching Home Ludens, a channel on history and board games. Today's live stream is a bit different. It's an attempt at doing something that I've never really done on that channel before, and that's talking about ethics applied to wargaming. It is a difficult subject as it requires from us, gamers, but also designers, to take a honest look at a hobby that we value so much and that can sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable. We'll address difficult topics tonight, so viewers' discussion is advised. And for this first episode of Wargame Ethics, I invited a panel of designers to talk about the depiction of civilian victimization in wargames. And there is already a flow, you could say, in the approach it, because it's basically inviting designers to talk among themselves about the ethics of what they do, and no one really carrying the voice of the people that were necessarily impacted by civilian victimization. And I recognize this limit, and I would like to be clear upfront on the fact that if you're watching this show during the live stream or afterwards, and you feel like there should be an extension to this discussion, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is available on my informations page on my YouTube channel, and I would be more than happy to organize a follow-up episode if I get interesting requests for it. If you're watching us live, as usual, feel free to react and send some questions to the panel in the live chat. And if you're watching this after the show, I have added some time codes in the description just below, so you can navigate through different sections of the show, because it should be also a pretty lengthy discussion. I'm aiming for probably between 60 and 90 minutes, so that's going to be a long one. We'll see how it goes. I'm very excited to have a very interesting panel of guests tonight. First of all, Brian Train. Hi, Brian.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. I have Tomislav Čipčić. Nice to have you here. And Javier Romero. And I didn't lie about John Poniske. He might be here, he might not be here. And Brian's theory is that maybe there was a bit mix-up with the hour changing earlier today in North America, right? Yes, so we'll see. If John, if you're seeing this, you can join anytime. It will be waiting for you and add you to the stream. But first of all, I would like to thank the three of you to have taken the time and actually accepted to have this interesting panel discussion about wargame ethics. I think it's really great. So I wanted to start by thanking all of you for this, and maybe we can start straight in with the introductions part, just to give a bit of context to our viewers here that are watching us live about who each of you are, provide a bit of context on what games you've designed, so we have a bit of an idea of where you're talking from. And maybe we could start with you, Javier.
Yeah. Well, about my designs. Well, I've been designing since maybe late 90s. My first design, it was designed for Command magazine, but it wasn't published. So in the end, it was published by GMT Games. It was the Spanish Civil War. And I have also designed for Alea magazine and Decision Games, of course, Battles magazine, and Against the Odds, by Victis, Common Japan, and several others, and Compans Games as well. And well, I live near Barcelona.
Oh, by the way, Javier, so you said that you designed a game for Battles magazine. Which game was that?
Yeah. No, sorry, I didn't design that. It was a development. I developed a game for Battles magazine. A game by John Poniske, by the way.
The one on the Philippines?
Yeah, the Amigos Insurrectos. Yes.
Yes, very interesting game. So that's why it would be John Weir. But please, Tom, do you wanna go ahead?
Who, me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I'm Tomislav Čipčić. I'm from Croatia, Split, and I design games. My first published design was Brotherhood and Unity. That was released last year. Already more than a year has passed since then. But I've been designing games before, but I never had the courage to step up and find the publisher. So I really love it, and I love the game design process, and I'm now currently moving on to computer games, trying to self-publish my next game, and then we'll see how it goes. I hope to have many games in the future. I have already a couple of prototypes in the kettle brewing up, but we'll go step by step.
And what made you take this step of finally deciding to have your game published, like to reach out to publisher to go to the next level? What was the trigger?
Yeah, I think I grew up. You know, as a fruit when you finally fall from the tree. So that's what happened to me. I got married, I got kids. My kids grew to be age 3 and 4, and finally everything fell into place. And this was the first game in which I said, well, first, it's an interesting topic, never covered before, and I think I really did a good job in presenting that very complex topic, and why wouldn't I try that? So I did it, and I succeeded, thankfully.
And we're happy you tried. It's a great game.
Thanks.
And you, Brian?
So I've been designing war games for about 25 years, maybe a little bit more. I designed, I guess I probably have pushing 60 games that I've published, and I've dealt with a number of publishing companies and self-published a few of my own. So some of my designs are very well known, like the ones from GMT, and others, like my self-published ones, very, very few people have them. But, you know, they're all on topics that interest me. And what interests me is areas where the politics and the military cross paths, and inevitably that has civilian involvement in it. So probably about half of my published work deals with irregular warfare, insurgency, something like that in some way. So I'm very, very grateful to be invited to this discussion today.
And we're very happy to have you. And I must say, Colonial Twilight was one of those times where, especially as a French person, made me think a lot about war games, what to present and how it would be represented, and the whole discussion around whether to include or not include the torture card within the deck was an interesting thing to think about. I must say. So I'm very happy that you're here. And as we've seen, all of you cover topics that are in your designs highly relevant to what we're going to discuss today, civilian victimization. And before we start getting directly into the discussion, I was wondering if you had on your side like a personal history with people taking issue with one of the games that you've published and the way you depicted it. Did you had like at some point an interaction with someone who didn't understood that you could make a game on such topic, or had like some sort of criticism around this? Maybe you can start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole question of morality and wargaming as a hobby, and you know, we're not dealing with that question today. I had an interesting kind of variation on the question that you're asking. It was last year when I had a quad of games come out called Brief Border Wars from Compass Games. And one of the games in this, it's like 4 small games in a box. And one of them was about the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974. And just before the game itself was released, I got an email from somebody, and this is probably one of the very few pieces of sort of angry viewer mail that I ever got, was from a guy whose family came from, I guess, northern Cyprus, and after the Turks invaded, his family had to leave, and they made their way to Canada, and he was letting me know in no uncertain terms that he had he thought that a game on this particular military conflict should not exist, that there was no way that anyone could, learn any lessons or even less get any kind of enjoyment out of it. and how dare I, and why don't you, why don't you just write to the publisher, this a couple of weeks ago, before it came out, and ask them not to publish this game and not to include it in the quad, and just forget that you ever designed it, which I thought was a little amusing, because, this man, as far as I could tell, at least he didn't tell me, he hadn't lost any family members or anything like that. His family had been probably dispossessed at short notice and had to move to Canada. But I kind of half knew who this person was, and I could see that he had collected and enjoyed several of the games in the GMT coin system, including Colonial Twilight, which has a torture card, including Andean Abyss, which has a limpieza, or social cleansing card or mechanic, and a distant plane, which relies on aerial atrocities and terrorism. And he was okay with all of that. But he was angry that I had designed a game in which, in reality, his father and grandparents had to move. Not to minimize, what happened to him personally, but to me, this was really a question of whose ox is being gored. It's war is a tragedy. It hits different people in different ways, and that really taught me, that certainly people react to this hobby in different ways, in general and specific terms, but they also react to the topics with even more specificity.
Yeah, and I guess it's normal to react more strongly to something that you're feeling close to, but I think it's interesting still to consider. And but you did release the game in the quad pack, right?
Yeah, because there's the way he had written the email to me, it brooked no discussion whatsoever. It was just bam, 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 do this, don't do that, And there was no way I could ever have any kind of a discussion with this guy. And of course, the game was actually coming out in about 2 weeks. So there's no way, even if I had wanted to,
it was,
it was that. But, it did remind me about something, because Fred, back in May, you were part of a panel at an online conference on designing war games on difficult subjects.
Yeah.
And you said something about Colonial Twilight and about I'm going to paraphrase you here, your doubts about whether a French game designer could have done the game the same way I did, just because of their cultural context, their education, and sort of like their political social background. They didn't have that necessary kind of detachment. Is that a fair?
Yeah, I did say that. I said that I think that for a French designer, doing Colonial Twilight would have been harder than someone that would have had a bit more distance, because I think the Algerian war is still something that is in some aspects hot topic in France. So I think it would have been harder, definitely.
Even today.
Yeah, even today. Yeah.
Yeah,
definitely.
And I guess the final thing, that I would say about that is that, a war game is not an objective product. You can't have an objective war game, a perfectly objective war game, no more than you can have a perfectly objective novel or painting or, piece of interpretive dance, because it's an object of art. It's a creative object, and it's informed by the designer's background. And it's up to the designer and to the consumer to kind of acknowledge that, to acknowledge where they're coming from and what they're trying to do with it, and to show the lengths that they've gone, let's hope, towards telling an objective or fair historical story.
And I think it's the point that I was making in that discussion is that you can never be objective, but you can be honest in your approach, and that's probably what you should aim for as a designer.
Yep. Honesty is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think so too. Javier, do you have an experience like this of someone reaching out because one of your game?
Well, not for a recent game, but it's for about a game I designed about the South American wars. But it was not a personal experience. It was that I didn't put the borders what they believe, that man believed that they should be. It was a game about, I put the border between Ecuador and Peru, and I include a region that it was claimed by Ecuador even today, because they had a war in 1995. And he began sending emails and posting on Consent Wall and posting on many other places, and even changing his name, but it was clear it was him. And asking me to remove that, and he did a mass media campaign, so to speak, that it was wrong border, and I had to remove that. But what I mean that even those conflicts that they are carried from 2,000 years ago, they still have they are still people that they believe that they are still important for them. And in particular because about 20 years ago they had a war in 1995 about that border. But about other conflicts, I expected to have more feedback from people from Armenia or Croatia or Bosnia about the games I have designed, but I didn't have any complaints. Maybe because they are magazine games. And magazine games often go under the radar of many people. That if you publish it in a boxed format with that they reach more people. For instance, with the Spanish Civil War, I had complaints why I didn't put in Basque or Catalan the place names, or vice versa. Why did I put them or not? And I had complaints from both sides. Because they were some of I even had an email from someone that he said that had an agenda about that, and I said no, it's not an agenda. So we decided for clarity, it was better to keep one name or two, but not put bilingual names on every word, because in particular, it's a game designed for American public, and American public don't like that, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it might be confusing for an American public to have for the same city the name of the city in Castellano and in Basque. That would be like probably a bit confusing. But
you design a game about maybe Transylvania. You have the Hungarian, the Romanian, and the German name, so it's that can be a bit confusing.
Yes, it can. And you, Tomislav, did you had any reaction like this for your game Brotherhood and Unity?
Yeah.
And it was a magazine game, and it's quite exposure. So I guess it must have been visible. Yeah.
The game was visible for a while when it got released. About a month after the release, I think it was in September, some local news agency picked up the news, and I had an interview, second interview, third interview. I even got a coverage in the one of the Bosnian newspapers on the front page even. And then people, as people are, starting being offended by the fact that I'm daring to, as Brian said, how dares he, from Croatia even, so he's one of those from outside trying to earn some money or something on our tragedy. And I don't want to enter into arguments with people, especially if they're outside of the wargaming group, because they first of all don't get the point of this hobby. Most of people, especially here, are very slow in finding out about this hobby. Lately it's not the case, but before it was. And so sometimes I did talk to some of them and try to explain to them that if you can make a movie or write a book which goes into very brutal details, and we know a couple of films have been made, especially films on various topics, even in Srebrenica, Sarajevo, or situations like that, why couldn't a good war game be made? Especially because it gives you another point of view, more immersed point of view. But as you know, I sometimes feel that these wars never really finish. They are just being put on pause until the next time, and people just keep brewing those ideas in themselves until the next time. I had a couple of those, yes.
Brian, you had a
Yeah.
follow-up. Yeah.
I wanted to speak on John Poniske's behalf because
I hope that he will speak on his own terms.
I
at some
hope he
point
comes too.
Yeah.
But if John were here, I'm sure that at this time he would mention his experience with one of his first published games on King Philip's War,
Yes.
which was one of the wars from like the 1600s. And he had an experience much like yours, Tomislav, because after the game was published, some local people picked up that he had published a game on this particular war. They were not wargamers. They didn't have any understanding of the hobby. And there was an awful lot of screaming and yelling in the press, the local press. But very definitely, it's always illuminating to me when I try and talk to people about this hobby and about these games, and just realize once again just how far removed it is from from most people's frame of reference or frame of experience. Everybody's played a game, everybody's watched a movie, everybody's read a book, but not that many people have played war games. So it's a difficult. It's like 3 times difficult to explain. First of all about the hobby and how you approach it, and then about the topic that you've designed on, if it's at all controversial.
Yeah, you have to educate them in the hobby first before anything else. And the thing is, people, especially nowadays, can post any comments online without any filter, any thought. So why even bother?
Yeah,
let them talk their way, and who understands will understand. And
and even before the internet, I couldn't explain this without sounding like some kind of lunatic. So, still the same.
To be fair, Brian, if your only gaming experience is card games and Monopoly, it is normal to feel offended by the fact that you could do a game on risk on a very sensitive topic, because you see that the level of concern for what you're trying to represent, you're trying to do, doesn't match with the fact that the topic is not frivolous, and you're like, wait a minute, those two things shouldn't overlap. And I think it's, from my perspective, I think it's normal to have people that are a bit concerned by this. And I would say it's also our work as people who are active in the hobby to also explain why this could be okay or not, and open up the discussion, but understand that some people might be concerned. I think it's fair, depending on where you come from and your understanding of the hobby. I think it's totally normal when you think, well, you made the Monopoly on Algerian or in Algeria. Yeah, that's a bit disturbing. So I think that would be okay. But that's it for the personal stories, and I think we can probably dive into the topic itself. So thinking about civilian victimization, and the first part of this discussion is about why or why not this aspect of a war should be depicted in Wargame. So really the why, and not necessarily the how. The how would be the second part of the discussion. And within this discussion, please feel free to draw from your own personal experience as designer, because I think this has a lot of value to illustrate the point that you're making. But just maybe to be clear, to talk about just to be clear on definitions. The idea of civilian victimization is the concept that of political or military leadership to target civilians or fail, and I think that's important, to discriminate between civilians and military personnel within a conflict. Whether it's, I think it can be either actively targeting civilians or just failing to separate. Like that would still be, and we can probably discuss the definitions, Javier. But for me, the way I thought about this was either or. And then it can be either to gain a specific advantage within a conflict, and that is one way of something, or just a casualty or a side effect of an overall conflict. And thinking about this, then my question is, can a wargame, in your opinion, afford not to depict something like this? And I'm gonna maybe start with a specific example, and maybe going back to what I believe might be the original sin of wargaming, which is depicting the East Front. A couple of months ago, we had a discussion on this channel about one book. It was this one. So we had a book club to talk about When Titans Clashed, discussing about Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent operation from the USSR to defeat Nazi Germany. And we talked about how this research was depicted into wargames. And something that came up quite frequently was the fact that the Germans didn't have any capacity to build supply lines far enough for the operation that they were having. And the fact that they were relying not on tracing supply lines back to Germany, but actually on getting supply from the land and practicing brutal civilian victimization, both because they were motivated by a deeply racist ideology, but also because there was a need to actually get some resource in place because they couldn't try line back. And the discussion is thinking about the East Front, and we're going to expand afterwards. Is this a form of whitewashing, of not representing the fact that the Germans couldn't trace supply lines back to Germany? Is it hiding something? Going back to the discussion that we're having earlier about war games are supposed to be a learning experience, can we really depict the East Front without talking about those things and only focusing on the purely kinetic or operational aspect of the war? And maybe I will start. It's a tough question, and we can start with you, Tomislav, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think one of the first tasks of the designer is to decide of the scope of the game, if that's even possible at the start. Yeah, I mean, every war is a very layered historical event, which can be seen from many points of view, one of which is military operational points of view, but also civilian, humanitarian, and so on. And really, when you are making a game, you are making a product which some people will finally play. So you can't put every stuff in it. You need to decide very early on what do you want to put in and what do you want to abstract to a certain level. Maybe even not put some things in because they do not belong there. And it's your decision, and you are sending a message. And every designer does that. A writer, when he writes a book, he or she decides what do they want to write a book about. Is that the experience of one certain man or a group of people or something? And even when you make a film. So I think you can and you must decide early on. And it is primarily based on what message do you want to convey. From my experience, when I designed Brotherhood and Unity, I didn't want to talk in detail about the crimes, because it's been talked about it a lot. But what I wanted to see is something different this time. First of all, why and how did this happen in the first place? Because it was illogical for me that, for instance, the Serbs could actually win if they had very tiny corridor north in Brčko. I wanted to explore that. And on the other hand, I wanted to see how could the Bosniaks defend themselves if they were scattered all over the map. And I wanted to explore that. And I needed to include, of course, some form of victimization. But since it was a card-driven game, I put it as card events. And I really had difficult time in deciding how much do I want to put it in. For instance, when I talked about Srebrenica, or maybe sniper attacks in Sarajevo, or shelling of civilians, or refugee crisis. I mean, 2 million people were displaced, more than 2 million people in a country of 4 million people. That's more than 50%. And how do you want to deal with that? And I I put that mechanic in as a foreign attitude mechanism, but only as an abstract. Early on, I was thinking of even including special counters for refugees. But just think about it, moving those counters on the map. That would be, I don't know, maybe gruesome experience.
You're going to the territory of how to depict it.
But
and I know it's going to be hard to divide the two. Yeah. But just to be clear,
why?
Just to be clear,
of course.
In your game, you made a decision on a level of abstraction, but you did represent some of the effects. You didn't remove it from the mechanic. Like, it is still here. You know that it's happening, and you abstract it to a certain level, but it's there. And going back to the example of the East Front, can you make an operational game that talks about the operational parts of Operation Barbarossa, for example, and decide not to represent that, and in a way, just not representing a key aspect of the operation, like that had an impact on the operation itself? Is there a moral dilemma here of representing civilian victimization on an East Front game, knowing that it was needed to provide supply to the German troops? Like, is there a divide here about? You can discuss about the level of abstraction, and that's fair, and we discuss it in second part. But can you make the decision of not representing it?
Yes, you are making a game, and you are the god of creating your game. It is your game, your message. Now, of course, it depends on your own view of the situation. And bear in mind that Eastern Front is huge territory, huge amount of people, and really game can only take so much of the mechanics. And especially if you are not dealing with card-driven game, I don't want to delve into mechanics, but if you decide on a mechanics that is not so suitable for representing civilian victims, then you will probably leave that out, maybe completely. And Javier, it's your decision, and the market will decide if you did a good job or not.
Javier, I saw you nodding
yes,
and moving
I would
on
like
your chair.
To comment. Well, I agree with Tom that yes, there is you have to choose what to show and what not to show in a game, because you can put it everything. But I would like to point out that sometimes we just follow what the historians said. Our games many times are based on what the historian says, and many of the games that were first published about the Eastern Front, they follow the historiography of 1970s, 1980s, that exclusively focused on the operational side of the game. And if they talk about partisans, it was like a sideshow, and we didn't even know until very recently the degree of devastation and economic exploitation that the Germans carried out in the Ostfront. So sometimes even the games that want to include everything in their simulation, they don't include those aspects because they are simply not contemplated. They just say the Germans had difficulties to supply their forward troops, but we didn't know what they did and why. Well, actually, I was going to say everything else, but I forgot. It's, for instance, when in the 1990s, the early 1990s, for the short time that the Soviet archives were open, then the people like we began to have another focus, more showing us more the Soviet view of things, like the biography by David Glantz, the book that you showed before. That it's still far from perfect, but it's a point in the right direction.
Brian, do you have any thoughts about this?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, probably about half of all the games I've designed deal with some kind of political, military crossover, often through irregular conflict. So many of my games deal with the whole idea of two sides or more than two sides, often dueling for the support, struggling for the support of ordinary people, people who are not in uniform, people who are not necessarily in power, but still have some role to play in events. So, so for many of my games, there's just no way at all that I could leave out the whole question of civilian involvement and especially civilian victimization in games. Some of my purely military games, like everybody else, I've done a game on the Battle of the Bulge. There's no aspect of it there because it's a pretty straightforward and short military campaign. But other games that I've done, there's just no way that I could not talk about the civilian population and its attitudes and what it does and what is done to it, even in a very abstract sense. And as for the East Front, a few years ago, Volko Runke and I co-wrote a chapter in the Zones of Control anthology that came out from MIT Press. And in it, I talked about the way that war games can really miss the point, where it's almost like what you call the Microsoft answer. The Microsoft answer is technically correct, but operationally useless. What I was alluding to was early East Front games, and as you said, Javier, these were produced in the 1970s, like Dreimechosten and Unentschieden, and later on Fire at Least.
The name said it all. It's
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they were drawn from German sources. But the thing that struck me about these games was the detail and the verisimilitude in the German orders of battle, where you had full representation of all of the SS divisions, with the Volksdeutsche in them, and the Sicherheitsdienst, people, units whose job it was, whether they were intended that way or whether it's just the way they operated, whose job it was to murder helpless people. But in the game, in the war game, there's nothing for them to do because that whole part has been elided. It's been left out of the game. And so what do you do with these, little black and white and black and red units? Well, you just throw them into the front line and they get ground up like cannon fodder. You don't really learn anything from that. And yet the designer, of course, has the motivation to put in this level of detail, even though operationally it completely misses the point, both in the design of the game and in the execution of the game. Now, I know that later on, later versions of East Front games have given, they've either removed these units and kind of like set aside the whole question of the partisan, anti-partisan, atrocity question, just simply lifted it out and sterilized it that way. Or they've included, some good, or more or less detailed rules about the partisan movement. And that whole aspect of the partisan movement on the Eastern Front has been really undergamed. And Javier, why haven't you talked about that game that you're doing on the partisan movement in the Soviet Union?
Because I have not.
I'm really looking for. I'm really looking. I know it's not published yet.
I'm working. It's an idea I have here, but I haven't developed it.
Okay.
Not yet, and I'm still looking for.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to put you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but this game will be one of the first devoted to that topic, and I'm very happy that you're doing it. So I hope you do publish it soon. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Javier, what are you doing here? You should be just working on your game, and you're here spending a couple of hours with us. Don't you have any respect?
Well, no, I've been working until 9 o'clock. So.
Good. Okay, that's fair. If you worked on it just until you joined the live stream, you were excused. You were excused. But going back to what you were saying, to Tomislav. On one hand, in the introduction of this discussion, we were saying that wargaming is a serious endeavor. It's mostly another tool to learn and understand about the topic. and on the other saying that a designer is just a god of his own game and he represents whatever he wants. Isn't there a fundamental contradiction here? And going back to Brian's example of you're basically doing a game that doesn't depict the reality of what happened, going to the point that mechanically some stuff don't make sense. Isn't there at some point like a moral responsibility for the designer to make the minimal amount of effort to show what actually happened? Like, isn't there doesn't the designer has a moral responsibility to make sure that what he's depicting is realistic and showing what actually happened, especially because he's a god?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course. We are in a hobby that tries to represent history in one form or another, and it is important, at least for us, if other people don't understand it, but we wargamers understand that, it's important for us to be as objective and all-encompassing as possible. So I'm still conflicted myself on that actual question. But if you take a look at movie industry, why not? Or books, you can really represent Second World War, which was full of atrocities all over the place. You can represent it in many different ways.
Before you go there, because movies are usually, if you're thinking about movie, you're talking about a narrative, and you make narrative decision. I think it's an unfair comparison, especially when you compare it to Wargame. Let's say that you had a documentary that was released on the East Front, talking about East Front operation, like the Germans' operational effort in the East Front. And if that documentary was saying nothing of civilian victimization in its content, would you be bothered? Wouldn't you feel like something is a bit off?
Is Wargame more of a movie or more of a documentary? What is a Wargame? And each Wargamer has her own opinion on that subject as well. As I said, if you look at the movies, you have Kelly's Heroes, which is a comedy. And even in Yugoslavia, you have very serious films about atrocities done by Chetniks, Ustaše, and so on. And you have, entertaining movies like, for instance, Walter Brani Sarajevo, or, for instance, Most, Bridge. So even in a country which was very serious about its history, like Yugoslavia was, at least from the partisan point of view, you had very different ways of showing that. And since games are, on one hand, responsible to talk about history, but also, on the other hand, are games and not simulations, you have more freedom than you would usually have. What I did in Brotherhood and Unity is presented in this way just because war in Bosnia and Herzegovina is usually presented only from one point of view, and that is atrocities and civilian casualties. But every war has many layers, and I wanted to explain and explore some other layers. And it was my personal decision to do that. I could have done a coin game, for instance. I could have done more of asymmetrical warfare. But for me, that was the thing I was trying to achieve. And I wanted to say something else. There are some games which you just cannot do without introducing civilian victims. For instance, the game I was planning for quite a long time now, World War II in Yugoslavia, cannot be represented without having asymmetrical warfare, counterinsurgency actions, because that was the nature of that conflict. That conflict was total war.
Then we go there, and so you do agree that if civilian victimization is a big part of explaining the layer of the war that you want to explore, even if it's purely kinetic warfare and operational warfare, you do have to represent it if it had an impact on it. So going back to the example,
not necessarily in the game mechanics. You can explain it in designer notes. You can explain it in some form of events, because some games are really not suited for representing civilian warfare. Some games are not. For instance, tactical games.
Yeah, but then again, on the tactical level, it is a layer that is an explanation, but on the operational or grand strategic level, sometimes it does, and it is a bit weird not to represent it.
If it really, as Brian has said, if it messes up with the historical narrative, then you need to change your game model. You cannot have those SS troops doing nothing. If you have put them in the game, they need to have some use. Otherwise, why are they there? So it depends on the scope of the game, on the type of the game, on the mechanics, on the length of the game, on many factors. It's not so simple. You can't just say you have a moral obligation. Otherwise, you would say you have a moral obligation in anything you do. We are not judges. We are just finally game designers.
You are the judge of your own decisions. So you can make a decision on a moral judgment on what you've done. I think there is an interesting comment in the chat from Joe Boyle that actually makes a distinction between what was the intent of the designer, what was the actual mechanics that were depicted, and the reception of the player. And that's also a risk that is maybe something interesting to explore. But do you sometimes feel like there is also a risk of the interpretation not being the intent of the design? And how do you circumvent such a risk?
Always happens, always. So no two people have the same interpretation. In particular, when it is a really thorny topic that can be a civil war. Well, actually, I believe that the civilian victimization is necessary when you simulate a civil war. It's in the name itself, it's civil war. Most of the conflicts since 1945 had been civil wars, but the fact is that very few games, comparatively speaking, have been designed about those topics because they are very hard to simulate in the form of a simulation or game. Why? Because there are many unaccountable factors you cannot count. There are no guns, everything is moral, politics, it's everything. There are no hardware. So designing a civil war, it's in itself is quite complicated, can be quite complicated, leaving aside the ethical aspects. But it's from a design point of view, it can be rather complicated. Actually, most of the wars we have had since in the last 70 years, it's civil wars, and in most of them, the civilians and military are very hard to tell where begins the civilian population and where it begins the military. There are many local militias, part-time combatants. It's very hard to put a strict limit between one or the other.
That's the place that I've gone to in, the majority of my design career is that space. I've done some pre-1945 games, but most of my work is during or after the Second World War, when we do have those border conflicts, civil conflicts. I've done games on the Finnish Civil War and on the Spanish Civil War. Spanish Civil War was one of my very first designs. And we've remarked on this already in our discussion. Civil wars are never, ever over. They can be hundreds of years in the past, and they're never, ever over. It makes me wonder whether the influences and the drives that caused the Civil War in the first place are ever properly addressed in any civil war. Does the war really end, or are people just hitting pause, as Tom said? And just a word about interpretation. Of course, people are going to interpret what you do, no matter, everyone's going to have a different interpretation, no matter what it is that you've done. I could write a note about how I've gone to the grocery store, and 3 people in my family could interpret it in different ways. So I like that question that was asked before about literary theory. What is the role of the designer? What is the role of the medium or the mechanics? And what is the role of the player? And that's what lends war games their additional perspective and distinguishes them from books and movies largely, is because of the agency of the player. It's a story that you construct. Now, a designer can put a lot of constraints on a game so that you do find yourself largely replicating what happened in history, or it can be a very wide open kind of sandbox game. But the point is that the player, the consumer, is much more intimately involved and has many decisions, to carry out in the course of the game. And if they're watching a movie, maybe the only decision they have is when to go out for popcorn or when to push fast forward. So it's that alone really lends itself to a really large variety of interpretations.
And maybe just because I would like to go to the second part and talk more specifically about design, but just have maybe one last question to ask to the three of you. I think there's something that recently happened in the video game industry. So there was one game that was released that then became a board game, and that's the game called This War of Mine, which was a very interesting approach to what is war, taking the perspective of the civilians, so completely radically changing the perspective on how do we depict war in gaming, was really interesting. And for me that was a very new and surprising approach. And I was reflecting about wargame as a whole, and I wanted to have your perspective. Do you feel that wargaming on those topics has evolved over the last few decades? Do you see a change? And if so, in what sort? Maybe we can start with you, Javier. Oh, Javier, are you still here?
Hello?
Or yes, yeah.
Sorry. Can you repeat?
Yes,
I did.
Yeah, you lagged off for a moment. You frozen. So the question was, did you see wargaming evolve in the depiction of civilian victimization over the last few decades? Did you see a change in the industry, in how the designer approach it, or even in the subject that are taken by designers?
In the last few decades?
Yeah.
That's a hard question.
You're not here for easy questions, Javier. You were here for the tough questions.
Well, I think that there are people that are trying to do things different. And in that sense, series like Coin are making popular some conflict that weren't popular at all. Because maybe 20 to 30 years ago, we were all playing over the same thing. It's Ostfront and World War II, maybe the American Civil War. Well, I also think that there are other games, like, for instance, the winner of the CSR of last year, Untitled, that it was a great argument whether it was a war game or not. Well, actually, I don't think that there is much apart from the work by Brian Train. Maybe I don't think that there is much civilian victimization show in the games. Maybe because it's a topic that can be really polemic, and people tend to avoid it. I don't know. I don't know if I.
And Brian, do you
can you hear me? Can you?
Yeah, we can hear you. You have a weird delay, actually. I can see you talk and then it cuts off. So I think there is a bit of a.
Yeah, because I'm using Wi-Fi, so it's not.
And going back to you, Brian, did you see a change in the evolution of depiction of civilian victimization in wargaming over the last over the last few decades? I mean, there was the coin series that appeared. It's a big part of it. Did you see a change overall, or not that much?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad that we're talking about This War of Mine. I tend to think that This War of Mine it has its roots in a video game, and now it's a board game. But I feel my approach to it is I feel like it's a board game implementation of a role-playing game. And there is some fantastic. I haven't kept up with what's going on in the role-playing RPG world, but there's some amazing creativity going on in there where people can really get into the experiences of people who are affected by conflict and by competition, and some of it can be really, really raw. But that's role-playing games, which are not. They exist kind of like to one side of war games, in my view. Like in a sense, when you're playing a war game, you are kind of playing a sort of role, maybe not to the extent that people tried to explain it as. But this is a little bit different. The other token is like another game or item that people talk about in relation to civilian victimization in games is Train by Brenda Romero. And I don't know if you know about that. Maybe you could look it up. Yeah. I won't explain too much about it. But basically, to me, that is not a game as such. It is more of an art object. It doesn't have the elements of a game, but it's an art object with an extremely personal and extremely powerful message. But it's not, again, what we're really talking about here. And as for growth and change in this aspect over the last 25 or 30 years, the reason why I started designing games 25 years ago is that nobody was designing games, the kind of games that I wanted to play. In the kind of, they weren't exploring the kind of topics that I wanted to explore. And so some of my very first games were games, well, I think one of probably about the very first complete game that I did was one called Civil Power, which is about riots and people fighting the police in the streets and mobs fighting each other in the streets and criminal gangs, back and forth. It was a tactical game, one of the few tactical games I've done on urban disorder among civilian populations, largely civilian populations. And the problem of authority versus those in authority versus those not in authority, and what happens when only one side shows up to a conflict with guns. And so that was one of the very first games I designed, like back in 1990 was the first iteration of that game that I worked through, and that's 30 years ago. Other early games I did were on the Tupamaro urban guerrillas in Uruguay. Nobody had touched that topic before or since. And that is something about social conflicts, class conflicts, and the whole idea of insurgents hiding among a sympathetic populace. And then, of course, there was a game I did on the Spanish Civil War. And of course, I've just gone on, from there. You were talking about the coin system. Volko designed the coin system about 2010 or so is when Vendée and Abyss was designed. Part of the inspiration for Volko's creation of that system was from my first game on the Algerian War, which was from 2000. So that's 20 years ago. And in that game, I had things like resettlement of civilian populations, terror, neutralization, pacification, the OAS, all these horrible things, and this is 25 years ago. So has there been change and growth in the system, in the field of war games? From my point of view, yes, there has, because I put it there. But again, some of my games...
That's what I say, that is, so only you maybe and a few others.
Yeah, and it's true. Very few people have been touching on this. Me and Joe Miranda, for a long time, were the only people who were really touching on this kind of thing. And there's been acceptance of it. And of course, some of my games, as I said, are very popular, but others that treat of this topic, only a few dozen copies are out there in the world. So, yes, there's more willingness to talk about the topic, or to at least to receive games on the topic. Maybe some more designers who are willing to accept it. That doesn't mean the audience, though, is necessarily more disposed to accept the product. Because, without diverting our discussion into the whole idea of politics and wargaming and diversity, representing diversity in wargames and these kinds of things, and all the crap storms that have erupted online about people say, "Oh, well, keep your politics out of my wargames." Well, these people are really, really missing the point. But that's another whole conversation, and another whole class of dullard. But
that can be a follow-up show, right? Don't go there around politics in war games, but that might be a suggestion for a future episode.
And not going there today.
Yes, from your perspective, Tomislav, did you also see that change, or do you feel also that it's limited to a few designers and a few systems? Or
as Brian said, he was probably the most famous one for a couple of decades now. But since the coin system has arrived, I think it started revolution, and you can really see that. Because the coin system really had hit the nail in the head, as they say, because it combined those mechanics which are relatively easy to implement. As Volko said, you give the player a Chinese menu of actions, and those games really clicked. And when they started clicking, we got a series, and now you have like how many? 12 games in the main series, and plus those coin small games starting to develop. So definitely, not only did it start to be accepted mechanic, but on the other hand, it opened the door for many conflicts which weren't covered before. For instance, you got Gandhi, you got Algeria again, you got
Colombia,
Pendragon or something. So many different games are starting to appear as a result of a coin system, and I feel very soon we will have many more games, because all these designers that designed all these games will probably create a new titles, maybe not within the coin system, but will explore some new avenues and new points of view, definitely. And this War of Mine is a very interesting game. I was in Sarajevo a couple of weeks ago, and when I was there, I went to a museum which shows the life in Sarajevo during the siege, and it reminded me of the game, because you had pictures of those buildings and those apartments which were converted into some sort of shelters, which look like the map in the This War of Mine board game. Incredible.
Yeah, I am completely floored by the amount of creativity and just like storming out that's been inspired by the coin system. Some people are doing some really highly imaginative, sensitive, and assertive work on this. And you're right, Tom, because it's not just the coin system that they're clinging to, but they're also exploring the topic of asymmetry in games.
Yeah.
And game design, which is something that's one of the major developments of the last 10 or 20 years, is
Yes.
people understanding how to use asymmetry in games.
Have you seen the latest one, Cross-Border Expressway, that is actually using the coin system to show conflict in urbanism, and you have social movements, the actual public institutions, but also companies, and how they fight over how this neighborhood is being shaped, and just this use of asymmetry is super inspiring, I think.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm definitely I got right on that P500, because that is a different level of civilian victimization. Okay, so far we've been talking about one side showing up with guns. But here, this is a whole other level of victimization of civilians and classes.
And I don't want to go
just
much into that direction, but just as a teaser, the designer should be on the show soon to explain more about his game. So I'm just putting it out there, a bit of auto promo. Soon there will be some content on Cross-Border Expressway on the channel. But I feel like we've already started talking about the second part of the discussion, which is how do you depict victimization, and how do you approach in your design work the representation of such things. Once you've made the decision that it's going to be a part of your system, what are the design strategies? And maybe going back to you, Javier, it would be interesting to see in the games that you've made that cover this, what forms of civilian victimization have you depicted? How did you approach each of them in your designs, and what do you think is the best way for you to be respectful of the topic, but also to really integrate it within the mechanic?
Well, to be respectful is because the best way to be respectful is to offer a learning tool, not a game in the simple sense of the topic. With a wargame, you have to learn something about the history of that conflict. And for methods I use in my games, for instance, is in Nagorno-Karabakh, the latest I published. It's a war that mixes irregular aspects and conventional aspects. It's about the war in 1992, 1994 in the Caucasus. And in that game, both players have a track. Both players practice clinical ethnical cleansing, and the more people the more refugees the enemy has, the more destabilization and the higher the possibilities of winning the war, which is the point of ethnical cleansing. For instance, in the one I did design about Croatia in 1991, you had instead of physical terrain, you have human geography. So you had to keep into account which axes were inhabited by a majority of Croatians and which axes were inhabited by a majority of Serbs, because that gave a number of advantages to one side or the other, and making an ethnical cleansing of those axes gave you a series of advantages from a military point of view. What I wanted to show is that why the fighting sides did ethnic cleansing and what did they gain from that. Because many of the PS proposals, well, I'm entering into the terrain of Tomislav. Many of those PS proposals, they were just based on cantons, so sides tended to consider that the more ethnically pure a region, the better, because they will get that region in the post-war agreement. I just wanted to show that in my game, but of course I'm not making a game out of that. I'm just giving the play. Well, I'm just providing a learning tool, and players are still free to carry out ethnical cleansing or not. But if they don't, they have a series of problems. If they do, they can have an advantage, but also a series of problems, because NATO or foreign powers can intervene, as would happen in Croatia, maybe. In the Nagorno-Karabakh, no one intervened, because when you have to, so to speak, underdogs, sorry for the expression, fighting, no one seems to care. I remember in the 1990s, we get very few news about what was going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, because it was like some obscure war in the former Soviet Union, but no one seemed to care. It's very different when there is involved a Western country than the level of media attention is very different. And another way to show civilian victimization is collateral damage. That's a number of mechanics I have included in some of my games. For instance, the Ukraine one, or in the Libya one that I did for Counterfact magazine, where you have one of the sides has plenty of firepower, but if you use that firepower, you save on your own casualties, but you can create collateral damage, which is a problem because it's a PR problem. That's the two major mechanics that I use in my games to simulate victimization.
Going back to the definition that we had earlier, it's interesting to see that you depicted the two kinds, that using civilian victimization as actually a strategic tool, and the other just as a side effect of the casualties of war and the way you integrated it. Before going to you, Brian or Tom, it's just that I'm going to bring someone to the stream that is just not 1 hour late. He's actually 1 hour and 16 minutes late. John Poniske, hi, welcome.
Hi, hello.
Yes.
You were right. The time change got me.
Yes. So and Brian was right. Okay, fair enough. So sorry about that. So just to feed you in, the whole part of talking about why depicting civilian victimization in games and talking about each of your personal experience with this. And now we shifted to another part of the discussion, which is talking about personally in your work. What kind of civilian victimization did you integrate it in your design, and what were your design approach to integrate them in your game, and how did you manage to stay respectful to the topic? So I will go back to Tomislav and for him to talk a bit specifically about Brotherhood and Unity. So to give you a bit of time to think about that question, John, and then we'll go back to you and finish with Brian. So Tomislav, yes.
Yeah, about the mechanics. Well, yeah, about Brotherhood and Unity, for instance, the idea of the amount of refugees that, as I said, more than 2 million people were moved from one place to another, not only within Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also to Sweden, to Germany, to all other countries. How would you depict that, you know? How would you depict all those shift of civilians? You have a great game as an example like Freedom, the Underground Railroad, which its main narrative is to show the move of the freed slaves towards the north. But I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to go there because the topic is so huge and so close to everyone's heart that you can't make it as a sideline. It needs to be the main mechanic of the game. So what I had to do is to represent it in some abstract way, as we usually do. But in what kind of a way to represent it? Well, mostly, as I told you before, I implemented a foreign attitude mechanics because I realized, and that's what we do. We play test and we see what happens and we compare it to the actual history and see where are the issues, where are the problems. I realized that you need to have some kind of limit to the aggression, for instance, of the Serbian faction at the start, because Serbians were overpowered with the amount of ammunition and equipment left by the Yugoslav army. So what would have stopped the Serbs from advancing if Bosniaks didn't have anything? Well, the idea was that the international community had to stop them. So, and why would the international community stop them? Well, because media coverage was such that the international community saw in a day-to-day basis what was actually happening, especially in Sarajevo. Sarajevo has been presented more than any other place in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but Sarajevo was only one tiny pack of actual conflict that was spread all over the place. And I decided to show it with a track that moved in the negative direction anytime you would create a refugee crisis. Because when the one faction entered the city, they would got around the civilian population, put them on buses if they were lucky enough to survive, and they were relocated to the nearest, for them, friendly town. And that would be broadcasted all over the world on CNN, on NBC, CBS, all other news Associated Press, for instance, and that would create some kind of tension in the international community. So you could only do so much of those ethnical cleansing actions, and something had to be done to stop you. And first of all, you would get sanctions. Then, if you would continue, you would get NATO bombardment. And hypothetically, I said, well, if you continued down that path, you would be losing the game because the NATO would intervene. I don't know if that was an overstretch, but something would have happened probably. So that was one way I dealt with it. And for instance, yeah.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
For instance, you had the problem of showing more heinous crimes like Srebrenica or Sarajevo sniper attacks, or for instance, I don't know, concentration camps. Well, I chose the card-driven game mechanics so that I can make a game events and cards which represent that in some form of a game mechanic, as you have in coin games, when you have descriptive text and the title which represents certain historical event, and on the other hand you have a pure game mechanic which implements that some way or another on the game board. So I use that system. But as I said before, I'm still learning. I'm young in this hobby, and what I usually tend to do, especially for my game to come, as I told you, World War III in Yugoslavia, I compare all those games you now have on the market and read those rule books and analyze those rule books and game mechanics, trying to find which mechanic would suit me well for my needs. Yeah, that's probably the best way to go around. Yeah.
And I'm sure that Brian will argue that he's still very in the hobby and he's still learning. So I wouldn't be
We are
surprised.
constantly learning. Yes.
So that never stops. Now going back to you, John. So first of all, thank you for coming.
I'm so sorry to have come in late.
No, it's fine. And you know what? As a punishment, if there is an episode 2 for Wargame Ethics, you'll have to come again. So that's just the way you'll have to pay me back. So I'll have and you can leave early. So so you the two combined, I will have you for a full show. On your side, on your personal work, what kind of civilian victimization did you depict in your game, and what kind of approach did you take to do so? Did it evolve over time, and how to make sure that you approach the topic in a respectful and also useful in terms of learning experience way for the player?
Well, first off, I would like to begin by making a general statement. Our wargaming industry attempts to replicate historical conflicts. On the surface, we are in effect creating competitive games that are based on horrendous suffering, both through the military and through the civilians that come under fire. We parse our battles, identifying leaders and forces, weapons and tactics. And sometimes we add in the peripherals like politics, supply, morale, weather. We try to simulate historical battles as cleanly and as simply as possible to make the play easy for the players. But war isn't clean and it's not simple. I remember sitting down with Richard Berg in 2009, before any of my designs were published. And he told me he rejected the term simulation. And he told me that military events could not be simulated, that there were far too many factors involved for us to get it right. We attempt to capture historical drama, but always we are falling short. And part of why we fall short is that war inevitably involves civilian casualties by accident or by design. And that part we leave out. I first was baptized on this particular topic with one of my first designs, King Philip's War, which some of you may know the controversy that revolved around it.
Yeah, Brian mentioned it in the earlier part of the show.
It came as a great shock, because the purpose for that design was to bring to sight or bring to the attention of the gaming community what I thought was a very little known part of our American history, and one that played a vital role in setting the stage for our revolution and for the dissolution of Indian power in the Northeast. What I did not know at the time was that when I was designing it, there was actually a street protest that had been organized by a Connecticut professor in Rhode Island. And she got wind of this through a newspaper reporter. I had called to tell him, here was a story he might be interested in. And he thought that was a great idea, not for the purpose that I thought, but for his purpose of stirring the pot. He immediately took the information I gave him to the protesters, and the protesters actually created a walking street protest to ban the game. It went statewide, it then went nationwide, and then it got picked up and it went worldwide. And for a month, I was reading page after page online of how I was a racist. And I was perpetuating the idea that Indians were savages. Never my purpose. The point was that we were not on the same page. She was concerned with the fact that I seemed to be perpetuating the idea that the Indians had disappeared from New England. And she was missing the point that I was trying to bring out a wrong that was done to them. And eventually we met and shared our ideas on a radio show in Rhode Island, came to an understanding. The game was published a year earlier than it was expected, and not a word was said after it was published. The air was cleared. In looking at the idea of ethics and heinous crimes against humanity that accompany war, I was thinking about some of the designs that I've done, specifically King Philip's War, which then spawned another, oh shoot, I forgot the next title, but the most recent that I'm working on, Pontiac's War, takes that first design and adds a great deal more detail to it, including the capture and release of hostages, which to my knowledge, I don't think that has been done in a Native American war game. I've also dealt with the Spanish-American War, or at least the next stage of it, the battle in the Philippines, which extended that very, very short, sweet war that Americans crowed about to 4 years and beyond. And the civilian casualties were horrendous. I guess the point that I am really trying to get across is I don't see a clean way of presenting the horror that accompanies war to civilians. But it must come out in the author notes. It must come out in the designer notes. The players have to understand that there is more. There is a very dark side to the game that they are playing. And once they understand that, perhaps they will be moved to research further and to take a look at our games and our gaming industry in a different light. I've said my piece.
Good. And now to you, Brian, how did you approach it, and how did this approach evolve over time? Because as we've said earlier, you've been touching on those topics for quite a while now, and you've approached you've used different systems, and would be curious to hear your perspective on this.
Well, thanks, Fred. Yeah, I mean, as I've said, I've been designing for about 30 years and publishing for 25 or so. Last night, I was going over the list of games that I published and kind of assessing them and recalling how I addressed the topic of civilian populations and how they were treated, or, you know, and that aspect in my games. And I'm a monster. I treated it in many different ways, you know, in ways that I think, you know, were relevant and suited to the situation. And and of course, at the initial question that you asked us, Fred, about, you know, why do this and for what purpose? And we talked about, you know, the reception of these things, the interpretation of these games. And I maintain that honesty is important. It's important to own up as to, you know, where you did your work, how you did your work, and what your work is intended to put across. And John, you're very right. Put it in the designer's notes, write it up in the mechanics, make it apparent, and just be honest with people about where you're coming from, because that's all you can do. People will interpret it differently, but I'm glad that you were able to meet with your detractor there and clear the air with her. That was quite a remarkable episode. So I've designed games at all levels: the strategic level, the operational level, and the tactical level. A lot of my work has been done at the operational level because I think that's a really interesting place where a lot of factors come to the fore that they don't at the other levels of conflict. At the strategic level, I've designed some games, like one on the Spanish Civil War, for example, another one on the Finnish Civil War, and some other games like that. And in these games, you're looking for kind of a maintenance of morale or support for one side or the other. And different things happen during the game that affect different sides' political support or their morale. And one of these items can be civilian victimization, or events that involve civilians. And where that's been appropriate, I've tried to work this in to kind of show the incentives that would, you know, that would make somebody, you know, that would make a side, that would make a faction in a conflict want to do something like this. You know, like we talked earlier about the Eastern Front, you know, and the question of the Nazi, you know, the German depredations on the civilian populations of Russia and Ukraine. And would they have done what they did to the extent that they did because they were hungry, or because they were also racists, you know, who were informed by this, you know, by these myths and this view that other people were subhuman and in fact deserved to be exploited and deprecated the way they were. If they were Nazis, you know, they did it. If they weren't Nazis, what would they have done? It's kind of a pointless question, because they were Nazis and there's not really any changing that. For like an example that I put in here was I did a game on the Finnish Civil War where one side or the other can purge a city or a town or a village that they happen to capture, you know, from the enemy. And there, the balance is the short-term versus the long-term effects. The short-term effect is that the enemy loses morale, and the more morale you make the enemy lose, the closer they are, like the more difficult things get to for them. And so that happens, but afterwards, the particular city or town that you purged, its occupation doesn't count for victory at the game end. And this is to show the longer term effect of it. So there's a short term, incentive, but the longer term means it's removed from the balance of counting up victory or loss. This is important for me to show, I thought, in that the Finnish Civil War was very much a class war. You had something like 1% of the population died in 5 months of fighting, and it was a Reds versus Whites, revolutionary versus counter-revolutionary situation, and the Reds lost, and far more Reds died after the war in white prison camps than actually died on the battlefield. That I can't directly show in the game, but that's something where you can show, where there's this kind of perverse incentive to do it, no matter what damage it does to in the long term. There was a hypothetical game I did a few years ago on the Third Lebanon War. This one hasn't happened yet, but this is the Israeli Defense Force invading southern Lebanon in order to try and stamp out Hezbollah once and for all. Like Javier, I did, there's a collateral damage mechanic in the game, so that if one side, usually it's the Israeli one because they have all the firepower on their side, if they inflict excessive hits, excessive firepower in a battle, then there's collateral damage, and you have a deck of cards with collateral damage effects that are normally tilted against the person who caused the damage. However, in this game, the Israeli player has a choice. They can go for a counter-force doctrine in totting up their victory points, which informs their objectives, or they can go for a counter-value. An Israeli general called this the Dahia doctrine, that was named after a town in southern Lebanon, that essentially, the IDF tried to erase it from the map as an object lesson, to the civilian population of southern Lebanon, saying, see, this is what happens when you support Hezbollah. Your town will be erased. So this is actually a choice that the Israeli player can choose, and this is where they're actually encouraged, or they're seeking this kind of excessive firepower and gathering up these cascading effects cards, which in the short term work against them, but in the longer term, by their thought logic, this will build up, this will have the longer term payoff of having less civilian support for Hezbollah just by cracking down or by crushing them in that way. That brings me to the larger topic of terror in games. We've been talking quite a bit about the coin system games. And, I think most of the coin system games that have been published have, or at least the ones that deal with modern counterinsurgencies, like A Distant Plain or Colonial Twilight, they have a terror mechanic in them. And this is actually one area where I differ with some coin game designers, especially with Volko. When we did A Distant Plain together, which is almost 10 years ago now, my personal belief is I go with a writer named Stathis Kalivas. He wrote a book called The Logic of Violence in Civil War some time ago. Basically, his argument was that terror against the civilian population is effective, but it's more effective at getting people to sit down, shut up, and withdraw from the conflict. But it doesn't necessarily build support for the instigator of the terror or the person who was supposed to protect them against the terror, the state generally, but isn't there. Volko was of the opposite interpretation. And he did have a point, because I guess the position you could take here is that if you kill off the supporters of a regime, teachers, tax collectors, politicians, and replace them with your own people, then in a sense you are building support for your own side. But anyway, in A Distant Plain, we compromised by doing it his way. But in the other games that I've done since then, Colonial, Twilight, and China's War, which is another one I'm working on right now, what it does is it acts to simply remove the support or opposition from one side or the other to, and it doesn't sideline the civilian population, but instead it makes it more difficult for either side to get anything done. And again, this is something that I've tried to mirror in many of my operational scale games. There's a series of games, 4 games I've done now using a system called the District Commander system. These are operational level counterinsurgency games. And again, in these games, terror can be caused by various things. Most often it's by excessive hits, in a population. There's sort of like a spillover or collateral damage effect. This can often lose a side victory points, from or move them away from their objectives, or sometimes it can gain it for them, depending on what their set of victory conditions or objectives happen to be, at the time. That's the short term. The short term will be to gain or lose these things, but the longer term, of course, is that having terror in an area makes it more difficult for either side to get anything done. So in game terms, neither player can claim the population's support for any purpose while it's still terrorized. So again, people have withdrawn, from the taking sides in the conflict. They cannot build infrastructure, which is sort of their government or shadow government structures, nor can they recruit, like militia, so that sort of thing. There were 2 games also in this District Commander system that have additional semi-autonomous factions. One is organized crime and one is non-state militias. These are factions, and their units appear on the map in response to areas on the map becoming terrorized. So when an area is terrorized, ordinary government by insurgent or the regime, the state, breaks down. You have an outbreak of organized crime because there is no more law and people still have to survive, or it can be something that gangs will exploit. And you also have non-state militia, which are people who are hostile to the insurgents and to criminals, but they're not really answering to the state or to the forces of law and order either. So these units autonomously appear on the map, and they autonomously act to basically cause more violence and more terror on the civilian population. So if you let things get out of hand, they just get worse and worse. And so there's another family of games I've done I call the 4-box system, just because of the way it looks on the map. And these included games on the Greek Civil War, the 1946-49 one, not the other ones, on the war in Algeria, and the counterinsurgency on Cyprus against the AOKA. So in the 1950s. So AOKA, for example, had, whenever you had you had these different menus of non-kinetic and kinetic missions. And the non-kinetic missions are things like mass political action, propaganda, boycotts, and subversion. These were drawn from the writing of Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp wrote several books on 198 methods of nonviolent organizing and nonviolent action. And of course, there is one game, at least one game, 1 or 2 volumes in the coin system that talk about, that give nonviolent factions and nonviolence a say in the process. So there were non-kinetic things that usually the insurgent could carry out that the other side could not react to. And then there were kinetic missions as well, strikes, robberies, attacking units and infrastructure that are a little bit more familiar to people in war games. But I thought it was important here to show that it's possible to affect the attitudes and the involvement of civilian populations in non-kinetic ways as well as kinetic ways. And of course, those depending on the game system and the game situation itself, they had different payoffs and different costs. But again, you try to show in a game that there's never any unilaterally best move. You do something, and of course, any action is followed by some kind of reaction elsewhere in the game system. So that's where, that goes. Another game situation that I treated is I did 2 games on street fighting in Budapest in November 1956. I did a sort of basic war game called Operation Whirlwind. And years later, I did kind of a marrying of that game with a co-design I did with David Terzi, who's a good non-war game designer, but still plays enough war games that we could speak we communicate through the dialect, called Knights of Fire. And in Operational Whirlwind, the Hungarian insurgent player draws all these hidden units. Some of them are civilians and some of them are recruits. The recruits are progressively recruited into better and better classes of urban warriors. But then you have civilian units as well. And if a civilian unit is assaulted by a Soviet unit that's in assault mode, it can be massacred. And of course, that counts in victory points against the Soviet player. So they have to be careful, but the clock is ticking against them. So sometimes they have to take a chance, and try to clear the streets without too much of a, being too careful about who is and who may not be a civilian. So we repeated that in Knights of Fire, but David also added the element of rescuing civilians. So on the one hand, you have these civilians in Budapest at the beginning, and the insurgent is trying to get them out of Budapest and conduct them out of the city and into refugees situations in Austria or Yugoslavia, whereas the Soviet player is trying to discover these civilian units as fast as possible and arrest them, because these are dissidents and people like that. So that was another interesting element of suspense. And again, this is non-kinetic. There's no massacres here, but there's definitely a situation and a mechanic constructed where both sides are interested in civilian units. One side's interested in saving them, spiriting them away out of the city, and the other is interested in arresting them. And I guess another theme in my games, as far as civilian units go, is about the necessity in a war game, in a war, in an active conflict, to keep a grip on violence, to keep a grip to try and manage violence as much as possible. So there was a game that I did years and years ago called Red Guard, about the Chinese Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And this was a huge political, not necessarily military, although military units were involved, but it's a huge, wrenching political and social event that went on for nearly 10 years, and mass movements surging back and forth across China. And in the game, you have the mechanic, when units fight, of doing subversion combat or purge combat. Now, subversion is when you try to either get people to stand down or to convert them to your point of view, because there's 6 different factions in this game. Hideous oversimplification with only 6 factions, but still. But also there's purge combat, which some units are better suited to do, and it removes your enemies permanently. But what it does is it contributes to this overall background level of civilian chaos and violence. And if it gets too high, if it reaches a certain point, everything breaks down and everybody loses as China breaks down into civil war. So all sides have to be aware of the short-term incentive of putting their enemies on the shelf permanently versus contributing to the general background of chaos and violence in the city, in the country as a whole. And of course, that's the other point with Civil Power, which is a tactical game, one of the few tactical games I've designed. Because with the authority player, the police player, normally he's the only one who shows up with guns. And he's got guns and tear gas and mounted policemen and helicopters and baton rounds and water cannons and a heat ray, that kind of thing. And so they have this technically this technical arsenal of violence, but they must keep control over it as much as they possibly can, because it's possible for the authority player to lose the game very quickly if they decide to become too violent. This is also married in another small game I did about 20 years ago called Battle of Seattle, about the World Trade Organization riots in Seattle at the end of 1999. Because again, both sides are very aware of their public image, and how you win or lose the game is by gaining as much, sort of image leverage as you can. And one way to break that down really quickly is to be too violent, whether you're, the protester or whether you're the police. If you're too overt, too violent in what you're doing, then you're going to lose.
That works when you have public image that comes into play, but I think you have a scenario for the Paris Commune in Civil Power. In that regard, public image was not a concern and resulted thousands and tens of thousands of deaths. So in that, they didn't really keep the violence under control, and you still have it within the system.
Well, that's another point that I wanted to raise in that Civil Power game about most of the scenarios in the game are these kind of largely non-kinetic, it's like a riot. They're like two mobs fighting each other. Or it's mobs versus the police or gangs or something like that. But there's also another type of scenario where you do have that violence. So there's like a Warsaw scenario. There's a Last Stand of the Paris Commune, where you have the insurgents on one side, and then you have the French army which is using field artillery, against people's apartments. And that kind of thing. Another part in that particular scenario is the insurgent can or cannot have les pétroleuses, which were these women who are supposed to be running around with cans of oil and kerosene, setting everything on fire. And what I found out in my research is that it's very possible that this was just an historical invention long after, just a myth. So you can have it in the game or not, but you are reminded that this is probably a myth.
So just regarding les pétroleuses, it's interesting because it's a myth that endured a long time after the events of the Paris Commune, which is weird because if you read in 1878 the memories of a right-wing conservative that was Maxime Ducamp, that was actually directly exposed to the events of the Paris Commune, that was not favorable to the communards. Him, as soon as 1878, said that les pétroleuses was a myth. So on the right wing, you already had people very early on saying this didn't exist, but the myth stayed on just because it said something interesting historiographically about what the communard needed to be for building a sort of a myth about the event.
Yeah, it just underlines who gets to write the history when the shooting stops. Whether the conflict is concluded or whether you've just hit pause, somebody gets to write the history and present it in a certain way. And that's yet another thing that we have to deal with in war games, designing them and playing them and understanding them. And that's another topic for another day.
Yes, and we're getting dangerously close to 2 hours of content in 90 minutes film.
Anyway, that's my catalog of atrocities in my game. So. Thank you.
And I would just ask one last question regarding the design approach before reaching to the conclusion, and it's just asking each of you, and maybe just a brief answer, but a personal question on: is there a type of topic that you will not approach because of the types of civilian victimization that is involved? And I will start with you, Tomislav. You were talking about the games that you're working on. So you're working on North Africa right now for a video game, and you were thinking about World War II Yugoslavia. Was there some games where you were thinking the topic is interesting, but I don't want to approach it as a designer because the topic for me is too sensitive?
Well, I first of all intend to create the whole series of games on computer. As you see now on board games, I will try to do that in computer world because they are that world is even less saturated. It almost has no civilian victimizations in the games, unless you look at this war of mine. For instance, the idea of concentration camps, which is very, very present, at least where I live, especially when you talk about atrocities in the Second World War and, of course, now in war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I really don't know how you could make a game out of that, unless you are creating a game of trying to escape from a camp, but it's more in domain of the Great Escape. But to really depict such a horror, I think, I don't know, it wouldn't be an enjoyable game experience. That for me is one topic.
And you, Javier, is there such topics that you wouldn't approach as a designer because you think it's off limit?
Well, I design conflict, and when there is a conflict, there are two sides that they can shoot back. So, in general, when I design games. I design games where there are two sides and both can commit atrocities, or only one, but in general it's two. So in general, well, I agree with Tomislav that they will never design something about Jasenovac or any other concentration camp. But what I design are what I try to design our games pitting two sides that they can shoot back. They can be asymmetrical, but they are they can commit atrocities or not. Or they have that choice. But in general, this is what I intend to do.
And you, John, any?
During the King Philip's War controversy, I was told that I might as well have designed a game on the Holocaust, on transporting prisoners to the prison camps. And then later I found out that one had already been designed, which really surprised me. What won't I touch? Something having to do with King Leopold and the Belgian Terror.
No.
Idi Amin's massacres. The Holocaust, naturally. The killing fields. Killing for killing's sake. That's my point.
And you, Brian?
Yeah, that's what I would probably echo John's remarks on this. John, if you're referring to Train by Brenda Romero,
Yes.
I regard, we talked about that earlier before you came. I regard that as more of an art object than a game. I don't think it has enough of the elements of a game, but it is still a piece of art that has a very powerful, very intense message. But I don't think it has, quite the marks of a game. There are things that I wouldn't touch because, because there are many conflicts going on in the world today, or have gone on in the last 50, 60 years or more, where only one side has shown up with guns. There's not an awful lot to be learned from those things. Nevertheless, for the last couple of years, I've been thinking and intermittently writing about the idea of wargame design as a form of civilian journalism. And Fred and Ricardo Massini, who I see is in the audience today.
Jan also is there. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't see his name.
Yeah, everyone is there. Yeah.
Okay, so these three criminals are putting together a Euro wargame anthology, and I've got a chapter in it about the idea of civilian journalism, through the medium of a wargame, where it's possible for people to try and put together a game on a contemporary topic as a way of distilling their own research or their own thoughts about something, and trying to use it to bring that interpretation, bearing in mind that it will be an interpretation, not the interpretation, to other people, as a way of synthesizing my own understanding of a situation and sharing it. And hopefully trying to involve other people in exploring the idea in terms of a game, and possibly and preferably leading them to do their own research and do their own thinking on these topics. So that's so. I mean, there is that, but there are obviously there are other topics that I wouldn't do. There are many topics in the world, past and present conflicts, that I wouldn't touch because I simply have not done the level of research, and I just don't think I will be able to do the level of research necessary to produce a good game on the topic. One of those is the Troubles, Northern Ireland. There's a guy called Hugh O'Donnell who has a game that will be coming out on that. That's something that I haven't touched because for me to undertake it would be a a very great amount of time and effort on research, and I just haven't done it. And I would need to do it before I would consider releasing anything on that.
And it's a game that has been mentioned in the chat a couple of times, and there is actually also in the chat Donald Hegarty, who's the graphic designer for the game, that is actually watching the show. So yeah, it came up a bit in the discussions.
So I'm certainly looking forward to these things coming out. And I see also in the chat somebody mentioned the Zenobia Awards, which are a fantastic step forward. I think I'd like to see that continue, and people's willingness to engage in these topics and just go beyond Bulge and France 1940 and that sort of thing. So good times ahead, I like to think, even if may not always be good times ahead for the world.
So I think that those are good closing words, and I would like to jump into the conclusion and do a short conclusion. And before we go there, I would like to say a massive thanks to Steven Ranzas, who had the original idea for this live stream, and with whom I have had a lot of discussions regarding this show. So for those of you who don't know, Steven Ranzas is the designer of The British Way. And it was interesting when you were talking, Brian Train, about Cyprus and Ioka, because in one of his in his box of 4 small coin games, there is one about Cyprus, and you really have this tension between kinetic and non-kinetic ways of insurgency, and it's an extremely interesting and thought-provoking design. So I wanted to thank him first, and then I had one last question to each of you. If I were to do an episode 2 of Wargame Ethics, and the question is highly sensitive for John because he will be in that show, what do you think should be the topic? And I will start with you, Tomislav. What do you think would be an interesting topic as a follow-up if we were to talk about Wargame Ethics, something that you would like to see discussed?
You got me there. I'll pass.
You'll pass. Then I will give you the option. It's not a definitive pass, like in some games. It's a pass where it can come back to you. And, and if you have something,
if everybody passes, the turn ends. So
then the turn ends. Exactly. That would be the point. Javier, do you have a?
Well, maybe hybrid warfare could be.
Could be an interesting topic. Brian, do you
politics and warfare?
Yeah. So yeah, the integration of politics in warfare. Yeah. Okay. Not the
how to simulate politics in war games.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And you, Brian?
Yeah, I think we've hit on a major point on ethics in wargaming with our discussion today, because again, this is a really important part of presenting war as war and not as a kind of glorified chess. Aside from that, I think other methods of making war besides the kinetic and the ethics of doing that. So what Javier referred to as hybrid war, or other people call full spectrum warfare. The ethics involved in that, I think, would be a good point for a conversation.
And you, John, any topic that you would like to address particularly?
I agree with Javier when he says that politics should be involved. But I think I would like to see game rules that include how a government deals with atrocities. How that would work into a game, I'm not certain, but I would like to see the player put in a position where he is a government player and has to decide whether or not to expose an atrocity or cover it up or make excuses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. On my mind, I had one idea, which was actually going one step further into the civilian victimization, and was to narrow the topic even more specifically and talk about specific games. And that was to address the topic of the representation of strategic bombardment in World War II and the way they were depicted in wargaming, to really narrow it down and talk about specific details, talk about specific games, and discuss really what in this game what is happening, and just maybe having even a more narrowed vision on civilian victimization on this. But interesting. If people have some suggestion in the chat, feel free to add them in the comment. And I think I will conclude it here. Maybe
Fred?
it would be, yes, yeah.
May I make one final statement? I
You
would
can.
like to add to what I said. I would like to see more focus on the victimization of Native Americans. It's been overlooked for way too long.
That's a good point,
The
especially to you
concept,
American designers.
for
Yes.
instance.
Just maybe before we conclude, I would just like to give a bit of time to each of you, maybe to talk very briefly about what you're working on right now, and then I will wrap up if that sounds good. Tomislav, what are you working on?
Yeah.
We mentioned that already a bit, but yeah.
First of all, let me answer to the previous question because I passed and I remember just
yes,
now,
that's true.
if
I forgot
may.
about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would really love to hear something about the global cataclysmic events and the games on that subject. For instance, for me, the issue that was always interesting was nuclear war, and I'm trying to create, and I think I'm on a good track of something to create a game that would show all the possible scenarios of the nuclear war, which are not just sending ICBMs and turning it into an arcade game, but something more deep, like Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, when the world really came near to destruction. And second topic would be, for instance, climate change and the effect of climate change on the lives of all of us. That is becoming more and more actual for us. What I'm doing now is creating my first to be published video game on the operational level of World War II in North Africa, which will hopefully come out sometime soon. And then later on, that will be turned into a series of games and I will cover Eastern Front, for instance, Western Front, and so on. And I have many ideas on the, as we told today, showing asymmetrical conflicts. For instance, showing the siege of Sarajevo, of Leningrad, of those types of warfare when one side is shelling and the other side is trying to break out. And I will try to create a series of games on counterinsurgencies as a video game, for instance, World War II in Yugoslavia and other games in the similar manner.
Yeah, a lot of work.
A lot of good. There are decades of work to come.
Yes.
I hopefully will be healthy enough
Yes,
to do
good.
that.
Looking forward to it, and you'll come back to talk about it.
Thanks.
Javier, what are you working on? We know that you are working on the Partisan game, and you have to, because if you don't,
Yes,
Brian is just yes.
Yes. Yes, aside from the Partisan game, well, I did an X-Encounter game on Bosnia. I think I told Tomislav already. And it's going, well, it was going to be published by Modern War, but Modern War is no more, so it will be published in Strategy and Tactics. And apart from that, I'm working on a naval simulation of the Mediterranean campaign in 1942. There are no civilians involved, so that's not a problem. And apart from that, I just published a game with Snafu. It's a new publisher.
Yes, that I highly recommend. Yeah, they released two great games, Ambon and Santander 37. Very, 37. Yeah, very nice games. And anything else?
And apart from that, that's all.
And that's already enough. That's really decent.
Again, for Compass, but that's for another day.
For the future.
Reimagining of a game I did 15 years ago. So for Alea. That is a new redesign of the battle, of course, with tanks. Front again, but this time without civilians. And that's all at the moment.
Okay, that's also a lot. I feel like the game designers have a tendency to do maybe too much project at once. And you, Brian, what are you working on right now?
Yeah, normally I've got about 5 things on the go, but with COVID and everything else happening in the last
narrow it
year,
to the most.
Yeah, I'm only working on 2 things actively right now. I did just hand in volume 2 of Brief Border Wars, so that's another set of 4 small games coming out. But I'm working on 2 adaptations of the GMT coin system right now. One is China from 1937 to 41. This is something that was just about to enter, blind play testing and development, just as COVID struck. Anyway, it's been delayed, but I'm back to work on it now. And another one that I'm doing is a completely non-kinetic twist on the GMT coin system. I've always felt the system was very adaptable to a power politics kind of situation. So it's on Canadian politics, the history of Canadian politics. It's kind of a reboot of the old SPI game Canadian Civil War via the GMT coin system.
Really curious to see that. Good. And John, what are you working on apart from waiting for the shipping of Plain Indians War?
Right. I actually just received an advanced copy, and the art, the components are just phenomenal. I retired 2 years ago, just prior to COVID, and since then I've undertaken a 15-book Civil War series. I've written 6 books in the last 2 years, so I've kind of set my designs aside. I am continuing to work on designs that were already created and in the works. I'm looking forward to Berlin Airlift with Nils' art, and Fire on the Mountain, which is my take on the Battle of South Mountain. I'll always keep my hand in the Civil War.
And yeah, so just for information, Nils is Nils Johansson, the graphic designer that also designed the 2 Snafu games that Javier was mentioning. So he's also in the chat and very excited that we're talking about his graphics work. Great, but yeah, he's amazing. I've been trying to have a game with him for a while now, and he always has a good excuse not to do it, and I find it extremely insulting. But yeah, that's just the way it is. But I'll get him at some point. I will get him. But it was great. Thank you, all of you, for joining that discussion. It was great. A lot longer than what I expected, but it's good. And John, you'll be back next time, so that's great. So I'm happy. And we actually decided that Brian and I will have a rules teach from Tomislav to play Brotherhood and Unity. So a lot of content to come. So that's we'll see. No, but seriously, thank you, everyone. Have a great end of Sunday. So there is not a lot of Sunday for you, Tomislav and Javier, but for you, Brian and John, there is a bit more. Enjoy this. Have a great evening, everyone. For everyone in the chat, it was great having you react and discuss and have your parallel discussion to us. That was awesome. And yeah, have a great week. And I hope to maybe be here for another live stream next week. I'm just not sure yet. See you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.